So, you've listened to the cast album, you've seen the show, maybe you've even seen the bootlegs, and you've fallen in love with the costumes of 6. But there's only one little problem. How do you make that? Hi, I'm Peyton, and today I'm going to walk through how I made my Anne Boleyn costume from 6 the musical. It was a labor of love over 6 months, took a lot of time, a lot of effort, but I'm going to do my best to break it down for you right here, right now. As well, this also marks the release of my Anne Boleyn pattern, which you can find on my shop, cospeyton.com. This video kind of serves as like a supplementary guide to the pattern, as well as just kind of a guide if you don't want to use the pattern and you want to wing it yourself. Okay, but before we dive in, I do have to make some disclaimers. Every single production of 6 is different. There are multiple productions going on across the world right now, and unfortunately my Boleyn is not going to be accurate to every single Boleyn's production. Mine takes a lot of inspiration from the original Broadway run of the show. It's honestly up to you to choose what costume you want to recreate. Each one of them has kind of different variations, and unfortunately I can't make a pattern that's accurate to every single one. So choose what one you want to do and make modifications as needed. As well, and I cannot stress this enough, make a mock-up. A mock-up is a crucial part of this costume. You are working with vinyl fabric, which once you pierce it with a needle, you cannot make that needle hole go away. It is there forever. So make sure your pattern is good, make sure it's tailored to fit your body, make sure you do a mock-up so you understand how to put the garment together before you move on to your nice fabric. As well, my pattern doesn't go over the square detailing on her costume. There are a couple different versions of the fabric that's considered stage accurate, and each one of them has differences of a couple of millimeters, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're patterning, it's the difference between life and death. So the pattern does not include the squares, however, I do go over in the video how many squares are on each panel and how to draw and cut them out. Here are some useful tools that I wish I had or I did have during my process that you will benefit from. A hand press. A hand press is less expensive than you think. It's about 50 Canadian dollars plus a little attachment that's about $10, and it makes setting in your snaps as easy as pulling a lever. I set in all my snaps by hand using a pair of pliers on my couch. It killed me. My costume is over 1,500 studs hand applied to it. There's a lot of studs on that costume. Don't be like me. Don't be an idiot. Don't do it by hand. Just spend the money. Your hands will thank you. Your body will thank you. As well, a walking foot. I can't stress how important a walking foot is, especially if you're using a pretty basic sewing machine like I am. The costumers of 6 use industrial sewing machines, which have a lot more firepower to them than your typical sewing machine. So a walking foot helps push the fabric on the top as well as the bottom and will help these sticky vinyl fabrics move through your machine like a breeze. I'm going to go over this as if you were using the stage accurate fabric. If you're not using the stage accurate fabric, that is completely okay. Never worry about being completely stage accurate. I'm just going over what I used and how I made my costume. You can make your costume however you want, and all of these steps are completely optional. As well, all of the resources I used for things I bought online are linked in the description, including my fabric choices and a local shop in Toronto that I bought all my studs from. Highly recommend them, they are fantastic. So to start off with the skirt is 8 panels in almost this triangular shape with a rounded bottom. Each skirt has 15 squares on it, 9 small and 6 large. You can see on my skirt that it's a bunch of little small squares on top and then the large squares on the bottom. The small squares are 3 squares on your fabric by 3 squares, whereas the large ones are 5 by 5. Each small one has 1 row of squares between them, while the large ones have 2. I cut mine out with an X-Acto knife, very carefully using a ruler, but you can also use scissors for yours. Once I cut mine out, I layered them over top of a layer of the green holographic fabric, and I used sewing clips to clip them in place. Sewing clips are really important in this project because once again, you can't use pins on this type of fabric because you'll see every single needle hole. So I use clips to clip things in place and then top stitch as close to the edge as possible around each of the squares. This attaches them to the green fabric and also makes sure that they're not going to go anywhere. Once I did that, I added a green layer of fabric to the back as well to sort of act as a lining. I put them wrong sides together so that they both face outwards, and I baste stitched around the edge. Once I did this, I covered up the bottom raw edge with a piece of bias tape, and this bias tape almost acted as a channel in which then I could put a piece of plastic boning. The plastic boning is really essential to the skirt because without the plastic boning, it's just going to sag. But the plastic boning helps give it that rounded shape, which gives the Boleyn skirt its such iconic silhouette. Once I did that, I sewed all of the skirt panels together, and this is where it gets tricky. I used a sewing needle meant for sewing leather, which is one of the thickest needles that my machine can handle, and I used high quality thread. If you use cheap thread, your thread's gonna snap and not be able to go through your fabric, and you're gonna have a really hard time. And if you use a tiny needle, it's gonna break all the time. Sewing together the skirt, especially if you're using the screen accurate fabric, is at some points you're sewing through up to 6 to 10 layers of fabric. It's a lot. So take your time, go slow, make sure you backstitch, and just pray. Just pray. Once I did that, once I had all the skirt panels sewn together, I took my bias tape and I bound all of those raw edges where I sewed them all together so that it looked clean on the inside of the skirt. Once I did that, I could install the waistband, and for the waistband closure, I chose to do a snap just for ease of getting in and out, and as well, my back 2 panels of my skirt aren't sewn completely together. They both have bias tape along the edges and then they're sewn so that it can open up a little more to allow me to slip in and out of my skirt with ease. I spent a lot of time applying my studs on my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/cospaydenlive, because it's a very, very tedious and slow process if you're doing it by hand. The studs on your skirt should be applied before you start sewing in the lining of your skirt, and then the studs around the bottom can be added either before you sew your skirt together or after you sew your skirt together, and the studs on the waistband can be added sort of, whatever. For my skirt, I chose 2 rows of studs on the waistband and then 1 row of continuous studs along the bottom of the skirt. Alright, moving on to the shirt. The shirt's kind of similar to making the skirt, where it's 3 by 3 squares, but they have 2 rows in between them. I really recommend using a paper mock-up and tracing out your squares on your paper mock-up to try and figure out how to make those squares look seamless when you're sewing over that curved seam. The way the bodice works is oftentimes you're going to have about half a square on the seam line, and using a paper mock-up you can kind of trace where the rest of that square is going to sit on the side panel, because they have a curved princess seam that goes across the bust that gives the bodice its shape. It's kind of a tricky little bit of patterning, it takes some finagling, so a paper mock-up is your best friend. I did the same process where I clipped the black fabric over top of the green fabric, top stitched down around all the squares, and then applied my studs. My bodice zips up in the back with a separating plastic zipper. This is what I found worked best for me. You might like a metal zipper, but I love the chunkiness and the ease of a plastic zipper. Metal zippers kind of hate me. Next, I go over how I did my collar, which is a bit of a tricky process because it's a flat rectangle going around a rounded curve, and this type of fabric does not want to go around curves. So the importance of notching and clipping your seams cannot be underestimated because it will help your fabric maneuver that much more. That goes for any seam in this, but especially any curved seams you're sewing. Make sure you notch your seam allowance so that you can sew them quite easier. The collar definitely was one of the trickiest parts for me. I had a lot of trouble on my machine getting everything to sit properly, getting everything to sew properly. It's just the importance of taking your time and taking it really slow. Once the collar was on, it was sort of the same as the waistband, where I installed a bunch of my studs onto it. For the shoulder bits, they're a little bit tricky to kind of explain how I assembled them together. What I did, I'm actually gonna get a piece of paper. The pattern pieces for the shoulder flaps look a little bit like this. And then there's also another pattern piece, which is like a curved cap sleeve. What I did was I sewed 2 layers of green, wrong sides together, added bias tape along each edge, and then I curved them around like this, around that cap sleeve. So that cap sleeve kind of sits in the middle of them. And then what I did was I kind of hand sewed it into the armhole of my bodice because my bodice was getting pretty thick and I knew I couldn't put all this layers of fabric through my machine because that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 layers of fabric through my machine, and I knew my machine wasn't going to be able to handle that, so I hand sewed it in. It was a little bit messy, but I knew it would be covered up by the lining later, and the lining is a crucial thing you're going to want to add to your garment. This fabric is cold. It's very cold. It's plastic and metal, and if you're wearing this costume without a lining in it, you're gonna freeze when all that cold plastic touches your body. So I installed a stretch fabric lining that not only wicks up any sweat and helps improve the longevity of my costume, but also makes it a little bit more comfortable to wear for me. The little flaps on the hem on the bottom of her bodice, I sort of did the same way. They're like this. They're like this, and then I folded them in half and I top stitched them along the bottom edge of the bodice. I accidentally made mine with too many layers of fabric and it made them super, super hard to sew. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing exactly what I did. I would recommend not lining the insides of them, but I think how the lined insides of mine look are really pretty, but it was worth a lot of struggle and a lot of strife, and I don't know if I would recommend it to everybody because it's very tricky to sew all this fabric. They're sort of assembled the same way as everything else. They're black fabric with a green lining, and then I added my studs along the edges, and I sewed them into the garment. You'll notice a lot of this is top stitching, adding studs, adding more studs, and then sewing the pieces together. For the choker, I 3D modeled it myself on one of my live streams and then 3D printed it in silver filament. I then went in with glass back crystals and I glued all the crystals on. I made it so that there was a little hole in the top of the bee that I could loop some ribbon through, and then I could sew that ribbon onto my collar. The actual one used on stage looks like it uses laser cut acrylic. I unfortunately don't have access to a laser cutter, so I chose 3D printing for mine. You can also use cardboard, EVA foam, Worbla, whatever you've got in your arsenal. Alright, now that the main part of your costume is done, let's focus on the fun parts. The wig is super easy. It is just 2 little buns on a straight black wig. I already had a black lace front wig for my collection that I pulled out and I styled on stream. I used those little bun donuts to help make her buns, and I also used hair nets over top of those bun donuts to ensure that there weren't any flyaways that would require extra restyling. She survived me 3 days of convention wearing without any need for restyling or any need for additional hairspray. So it's a pretty good method if I do say so myself. As well, for the spiky bits that go around her buns, I just used a piece of leather trim, a couple of studs that I installed, and some Velcro to attach it to her hair. I know in the actual Broadway production they also attach horsehair braid to make it easier to pin into the wig, but I'm not doing as much strenuous movement as they are when I'm wearing the cosplay, so I didn't really find it necessary. The earrings were made in a similar way to the bee choker we covered earlier, where I 3D modeled them on stream, I 3D printed them, and then I bedazzled them. I think they're super cute, and I honestly want to wear them in my everyday life. A fun little fact about the 6 costumes is that each earring for each queen has the Roman numeral of which queen they were. So Anne Boleyn has the Roman numeral for 2. For the green sleeves, I'm not going to touch on them too much because they're kind of ugly and I really don't like wearing them, but they were very quickly made with leftover green fabric from the bodice, leftover stretch fabric which I used for the lining and the underbody suit, which I'll cover in a minute, and a little bit of stretch mesh that is also from the underbody suit. The underbody suit I won't cover too much because it's a super simple sewing pattern. It's just a simple bodysuit cut into 3 sections, an upper part, a mid part, and a lower part. The upper part and the lower part are a solid black fabric, while the mid part is a mesh fabric. The mid part is the only part that you see peeking out of the costume. It's kind of like the little midsection part, and the rest of it just sort of gives me a little bit of coverage. I chose to make a bodysuit because I didn't want to have to worry about making a top and bottoms and having to worry about one of them riding up or riding down. A bodysuit keeps them all together and then I don't have to worry about it. It just zips up in the back. It's super simple. It's just stretch fabric, a little bit of zigzag stitch, and it's cozy as hell. For the final details of my costume, I used a pair of fishnet tights that were pre-bedazzled from Spirit Halloween, as well as a pair of fleece-lined tights I got off of Amazon because I was wearing this costume at Broadway Con in New York City in February, and it was cold. I kind of can't sing the praises of fleece-lined tights enough. They're kind of awesome. This was my first time using fleece-lined tights, and they are so cozy. I was not cold at all. It may be because I'm from Canada, New York City's not that cold compared, but I wasn't cold at all. And that's how I made my Anne Boleyn costume. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them in the comments below, and also make sure you pick up my pattern at cospayton.com. As well, I'm currently trying to get into the YouTube partner program, so any likes, comments, subscribes, or shares with your friends help me get there, and it's very much appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and happy making!